Well, hello. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Texas PACE Training for Title Companies. I'm Marina Bedoin-Criticos, Senior Program Advisor at Texas PACE Authority, where I assist with program and project management, and I am delighted to be with you all today to talk about this. Let's start off with a few housekeeping items. First, all lines are muted. If you would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box for discussion during the Q&A portion of the session. The session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording along with a PDF of the presentation. And if you would like to receive a PDH certificate for this session, please email administrator@texaspaceauthority.org. So here's our agenda for this session. We'll start off with an overview of the Texas PACE program. Then we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into the closing process and related documents. And we'll wrap up with some additional materials, tools, and resources before opening up for the Q&A. So let's get started with an overview of Texas PACE. So starting off, Texas PACE Authority, the group that I represent, is a nonprofit organization that administers the Free Market Texas PACE program across the state of Texas on behalf of local governments. In this role, we oversee the transactions for this free market program on behalf of the local governments, and we ensure that the uniform standards, technical guidelines, and best practices that were developed through the PACE in a Box standards are adhered to. We also assist with policy and program development and implementation, as well as providing education, outreach, and the development of market tools and resources, such as this webinar. So the Texas PACE program was established by the state legislature almost a decade ago to help incentivize property owners to implement upgrades that could help improve energy and water conservation efforts. It really is set up as a local adoption model, which means that it's up to each region, each county or city to adopt the program since the state has enabled the legislation. And as the program administrator, really our role, Texas PACE Authority, we administer the program on behalf of the local governments. So we work with the property owners, the capital providers, and the service providers to ensure that all the statutory requirements, as well as the PACE in a Box uniform standards, are adhered to. So the way the program is structured, there's no cost, liability, or additional administrative burden to the local government or to the taxpayers, as this is a voluntary free market program, with the property owner deciding which service providers and which capital providers to work with. So Texas PACE Authority currently administers programs in 80 regions across the state, and this number really continues to grow. As you can see on the map on the right, there's a large number of the regions where we have high amounts of population in the state of Texas that are covered. Over 70% of the population across the state is currently in a PACE-enabled region. So property owners who are looking for ways to finance energy efficiency, water conservation, and distributed generation upgrades really don't have far to look. And this is a market that is growing. As you can see here, we've got a nice kind of hockey stick trajectory that we've been seeing over the course of the past years where PACE has been enabled in Texas, and the diversity of projects that have leveraged PACE range from hospitality to multifamily, office, warehouse, nonprofit, and more. So investment to date currently is now over $226 million invested in these projects across the state. And it's not just in Texas where we're seeing this growth. As you can see on this map, across the country, over 38 states plus the District of Columbia have passed enabling legislation for PACE. And so what this means is across the country, we're seeing the same type of trajectory as far as leveraging PACE to create energy efficiency, water conservation, and distributed generation upgrades. Currently, over $3.4 billion have been invested in nearly 3,000 projects across the country using PACE since 2009. So we've been tossing around this acronym PACE, and I'm sure some of you are asking, what is this? What does it really stand for? So PACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. And this is a market-driven finance option that can help to accelerate the deployment and adoption of water conservation, energy efficiency, and distributed generation practices, as well as to help as an economic development tool for a lot of regions as well, increase local jobs growth. So at a high level, PACE is available for commercial, industrial, nonprofit, and multifamily of 5 units or more. And this multifamily section also includes the affordable housing sector. Now, PACE is not available to be used on government-owned property, single-family property, or greenfield property, or property that has not been previously developed. It really was structured to be a retrofit program designed to retrofit existing developed properties, make them more efficient. And it can also be used for resiliency and recovery projects across the state as well. So in essence, this tool provides a free market, readily available source of financing for these specific aspects of redevelopment. Now, PACE is not a traditional loan. It's a voluntary assessment, similar to a sidewalk or a sewer assessment. And the assessment is equal to the cost of the energy or water investment that's placed on the property and secured with the senior lien. So here are the property types that are able to leverage PACE. One of the first things that a property owner would need to do if they're considering PACE as a financing mechanism is to determine if their property is eligible. So eligible properties, as you can see on the left side of your screen, as we mentioned earlier, include commercial, which is office, hospitality, nonprofit, retail, industrial, that also encompasses manufacturing and agriculture, and multifamily of 5 units or more. Now, as I stated, properties that are not eligible for PACE include government property, such as state and municipal buildings, school districts, water authorities, et cetera. There's a program out of the State Energy Conservation Office called Lone Star, called Lone Star, which is a program that would work well for these type of government properties. Also not eligible are undeveloped lots or lots undergoing development at the time of the assessment. Now, PACE really is a program, as I said, designed to retrofit existing properties and make them more efficient. Now, also, in addition to it being the appropriate eligible property type, the property also needs to be in a region that has been, where PACE has been enabled. So if you're working on a project that's interested in PACE and it's not currently in a region that's highlighted on the map, please reach out to TPA for information on how to get that type of program adopted. In addition to being in a region that's adopted PACE and being an eligible property type, the improvement eligibility requires technologies that reduce energy consumption or demand, or technologies that generate electricity or on-site and are permanently affixed to the property. So with this, what we're seeing is, a variety of measures. There's not a prescriptive list because I think the knowledge was when the program was created, technologies are constantly changing and transforming. So what we really need to be able to prove up is that these technologies have the ability to be calculated behind the customer side of the meter as far as energy generation and reducing on-site energy or water consumption. Also, they do need to be permanently affixed to the property. So we're looking at, your items such as your lighting, building envelope, be it roof, fenestration, tightening up the building envelope, as well as insulation, plumbing measures as well, exterior irrigation, fan motors, pumps, and more. So how does the PACE program work? So, as we stated earlier, this is a voluntary program. The property owner in a region that has enabled PACE selects a project, finds a contractor, identifies a capital provider, and then applies to the PACE program. Assuming the property owner, the building, and the project meet all of the PACE requirements that were outlined earlier, then there is a series of contracting that goes into place that we'll detail out in the coming slides, where the owner signs a contract with the PACE program, which places a senior lien on the property. And that is really the end result of this PACE project, is a voluntary lien that's filed at the local tax office. And this is a document that exists from the date on which the notice is recorded until it's fully paid. And this document has the same priority status as a lien for any other ad valorem tax, and it does run with the land. So if there's any unpaid portion, it does transfer to a new owner upon sale. Now, if there is a mortgage on the property, the consent of the mortgage holder is required, and we'll go into a little bit detail about that as well. In addition to the contract with the PACE program, which places the senior lien on the property, there's also a capital provider contract with the local government in exchange for the assessment payments. And that right there creates that triangle, which gives the capital provider the level of comfort and security to supply the funding for these energy and water efficiency projects on the buildings or on the property. And then at the end, the owner then sends the installation payments directly to the lender. So let's walk through a little bit on the documentation process. So here is a list of the required documents for a PACE project. Some of these may be familiar from some of the other due diligence work that you all may do, or the documents that you collect as part of other project closings. Some of these are very specific to the PACE program. Might seem like a bit of a list, but don't worry. Typically with title companies, these are the 5 documents that you will most often see. Starting with the property title report prepared by a title insurance company, and this may be a document that you all generate for a specific project. And definitely this is something that is required for the program administrator to be able to ascertain that the property description, as well as whether or not there are any encumbrances currently on the property. The certificate of incumbency and consents or company organizing documents. These are documents that indicate who the authorizing signatory are. Oftentimes these are executed at time of close, so maybe part of the closing package of documents that you receive. And then the other item in orange, which you may see from time to time, is the lender consent to PACE assessment form. As we mentioned earlier, in Texas, it is required that the senior lien holder consent to the PACE assessment taking senior lien position, and we'll go into a little bit of detail of that shortly as well. The 2 sets of documents that you will receive every single time when we're looking at a title company handling a closing are the executed owner, lender, and notice of assessment contracts that I talked about in the previous slide, as well as the underlying finance documents. So let's go into a little bit of detail in these. So these are the main documents, as I mentioned, that you'll see in closing. The owner contract is the first one. So as part of a PACE project, the property owner will sign a contract with the local government where the property owner voluntarily consents to having the PACE assessment placed on the property as a way for paying for the building upgrades. The lender contract is the next item. And in this, the PACE capital provider signs a contract with the local government where the government assigns the proceeds of the assessment to the PACE capital provider. And then the end result of this project is a voluntary lien, which is the notice of contractual assessment. And this is filed at the local tax assessor collector. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a document that is in existence from the date upon which the notice is recorded until it's fully paid. Now, all 3 of these documents must be signed and notarized, and the notice of assessment cannot be recorded without TPA's written approval. And when a project like this comes to you, one of the first items that come to the title company before the contracts or any documentation is indeed a letter of instruction. So we'll get to that in a couple of slides, but just wanted to make you aware that don't worry about trying to figure out what goes where. We actually will provide you with a enumerated list of what needs to be done when, and the ability to check everything off. The next item that I had mentioned that you will see every single time in a closing, excuse me, in addition to the contracts, is the underlying finance documents. Sometimes it's one document, sometimes it's the 4 that are listed here, sometimes it's more. These are the lender's financing documents, and these detail the interest rate, financing terms, as well as the repayment terms. Often these vary from project to project, as well as lender to lender. So a reference block similar to this one will be listed on the owner and on the lender contracts. And the executed financing agreement must be submitted to Texas PACE Authority as part of the document package for review prior to filing the notice of assessment. So similar to the contracts and some of the other documents, those all may be assembled and ready to be executed day of close. So those signature pages likely will be circulated day of close. A couple of the nuanced pieces that we look for on our end is that the term may not exceed the useful life of the qualified improvement. And on the payment schedule, the payments may be monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, or annual. The disbursement agreement as well varies with the disbursement typically depending on the project and when the draws are. So with that, I would say that the consistency is in the inconsistency. And this is the document, one of the documents that you might see. As I mentioned, lender consent is required. So if there is a senior lien on the property, the consent of the senior lien holder is required in writing. So this is one of the documents that we typically receive in this specific format. And basically it provides information about the property, what the amount that is approved, and will also have an exhibit attached to it that is the property description. This is another document that must be executed and approved by TPA prior to you being able to file the notice of assessment. So here are some of the frequently asked questions that we get from title companies. First one, who sends the title company the contracts? A lot of times the title company is already engaged by the property owner or the lending team. And so then TPA will come in as part of the process. Texas PACE Authority will send the title company the final documents for review. Oftentimes the signatures will be sent to the title company to be held in escrow. And then the package will be assembled. When does the notice of assessment need to be filed? Depends on how the instruction letter goes, but typically the notice of assessment cannot be filed until you have received written authorization from Texas PACE Authority. And that will be delineated again in the instruction letter that we referenced. Mortgage consent document, actually, we just went through. And one of the items that we've been running up against lately, what's the difference between closing only the PACE transaction and filing just the notice of assessment, and filing the notice of assessment along with other types of financing that are closing simultaneously? Again, the answer to this one is it depends. Depends on the complexity of the capital stack that's been put together. It depends on, excuse me, the different items that are closing that day. But typically prior to close, TPA will coordinate with the lenders to ensure that the instruction letter or letters that are going to you will definitively detail what needs to be closed and filed in what order. And then at the end of this, the final executed hard copy document package, there is a notice at the end of the contracts for a final hard copy set to be submitted to Texas PACE Authority. Part of the arrangements that will be made, hopefully prior to you all getting the documents, is the number of what signature pages that are required and how and where those should be dispersed. Again, that will all be detailed out in the instruction letter. So quick overview here of the closing process that we have. Starting up at the top left, so Texas PACE Authority will send the final documents to the title company. Then the development team and Texas PACE Authority will send the executed signature pages to the title company. Again, sometimes those are sent in advance to be held in escrow. Once the title company has everything in order, on day of close, they'll scan and send to TPA the executed owner and lender contract signature pages for review so we can have a full set. And then once we approve and authorize the release of the notice of assessment, then there is a line item on the last page for the title company to enter in the execution date. And if there are finance documents or other documents, including the mortgage consent, then those will need to be submitted to us electronically for review and approval as well. And then once we've approved everything, then we'll ask you to slip in the signature pages into the contracts. Some of the contracts have multiple exhibits on them. For example, the owner contract needs to have the lender consent slipped in, as well as the notice of lien assessment also needs to be slipped into the owner contract. So there are a few pieces there that need to be put together, which is why we ask after you assemble the package that the documents are then emailed to TPA for review and approval. And then once we have reviewed it, we will respond back in writing via email to proceed with filing the notice of assessment with the county clerk. And once the documents have been filed and the stamped copy has been received, then we ask that the final stamped scans are sent to everyone with the originals sent to the parties as listed in the instruction letter. And then following that is the disbursement of PACE administrative fees alongside the other fees that are in the project. And as I mentioned, an instruction letter is definitely something that we provide that provides very clearly delineated instructions regarding the procedures, as well as the order of the execution of the documents and recording to ensure that the PACE financing is processed properly and that the loan is closed. So beyond closing, there are sometimes some additional items or documents that might come your way after a project is closed. So the first one is the sale and transfer of property notice. So as PACE really is a debt of property, the repayment obligation can transfer with the property ownership if the buyer agrees to assume the PACE obligation. And the new senior lender allows the PACE obligation to remain on the property. So if that's the case, then TPA needs a sale and transfer of property notice to be submitted, informing TPA of the transfer of property. Sometimes this happens with either the ownership or the lending team. Sometimes, though, this is one of the documents that is completed at the closing transaction. So wanted to make you aware that this is one of the documents that potentially could come across your desk. This document, however, does not need to be notarized. And we also understand that debt gets reassigned. So in that case, there is an assignment notice that does need to be completed by the lender, telling us who the project has been assigned to, and this must be completed and submitted to TPA as well. Again, this is another document that does not need to be notarized. And then one of the questions that we get asked is what happens in the case of delinquency or foreclosure. So with PACE, delinquent installments incur interest and late penalties in the same manner as delinquent property taxes. And the timeline for the enforcement by foreclosure are very clearly outlined in the lender contract. And the enforcement and foreclosure of a PACE assessment lien has to be done in the same way, and it has to be done in really the name of the local government. And foreclosure is by a judicial process, just as you would see foreclosure of a property tax lien. So in that case, in many ways, this mirrors what you would see in a property tax lien case. And for those of you who are interested in playing a little bit more in the Texas PACE space, we do have an online service provider directory that provides links to service providers, capital providers, contractors who work in this space. Definitely would recommend that you take a look at the service provider directory URL that's highlighted on this page. And if you are interested in participating and being listed on the website, please reach out to us to learn more. And here is a list of resources that may be helpful to you as you look in digging through how you can best engage with the process. The first is the required documents checklist, which is that checklist that I showed you earlier that listed out all of the documents that are required as part of a Texas PACE program. The second is the service provider directory, which we went over on the last slide. The next item is just a link to the Texas PACE statute, if you'd like to dig in and find out what the policy is behind the program. And then we have a link to the map of the service areas or the areas where the region has been enabled. And then finally, we have a link to the AG opinion. So with that, let us open it up for Q&A. A reminder, if you have some questions, all lines have been muted, so please put the questions into the chat box. Okay, it looks like we have a question here asking about timeline. So there's kind of two aspects to that question, I think. One is the timeline of a PACE project in totality. Once an application has been received and approved, it can take anywhere 45 days plus, depending on how quickly the development team gets the documentation to us to get the project to closing. As far as closing, as mentioned, as soon as we become aware that a title company will be involved in the closing process, we will reach out to you with a preliminary instruction notice that will get tightened up closer to the close date once that has been identified. And then, of course, for companies where it's one of the first times or actually any time you're walking through a PACE transaction, we understand that may not be a transaction that you handle on a regular basis. So of course, we are always on hand to answer any questions that you may have about the process and procedures. So thank you all for attending, and this session has now concluded.